You are listening to the IoT For All Media Network.
So I wanted to use the opportunity of speaking with you today to talk a lot about IoT kind of from an international standpoint. So I've had a lot of guests on that are very focused on different markets around the world. Also, a lot of guests who are focused much on the North American market. But I think there's an interesting perspective to kind of talk about deploying IoT internationally. So I wanted to kind of just to start off is from your perspective, what are the main things that need to be thought about when a company is looking to kind of expand internationally with an IoT solution?
So IoT is a quite broad term, and it's much broader than what machine to machine.
Sure.
If I talk about connectivity for a car, you've got different type of connectivity for a car. You have a telematic aspect, which is kind of a machine to machine services. Then you have a software update, which is another kind of machine to machine, but kind of different. Then we have what we call infotainment. By infotainment, first is you want the car to be connected to know the traffic information when you want to go from point A to point B. But then it's a service which is for the end user, for the consumers. You may want to have internet radio services, and you might want to buy more connectivity to have more internet radio. You also may want to have Wi-Fi on board, and this is really an internet access services. Then when you are dealing with consumers, you basically have to, in Europe, but also in the US, to comply with regulations for mobile operators. And you have regulation and constraint, which is not only imposed by the telecom regulator, but also for Ministry of Interior in terms of identification of who is the driver, which means that from a regulatory standpoint, it's much more complex. Machine to machine is kind of straightforward, but when you go into the IoT, where you manage when you start to mix B2B IoT and B2C IoT, where consumers are involved, then the regulatory weight is much bigger. And if you consider Europe as a continent, with all the countries we have, with all the language we have to manage, then it's much more complex to deploy internationally. So Transatel has developed over time the capacity to deploy the services in every countries of Eastern Europe, but also in the US, but also in Japan, in India, and in many other countries in the world, where we made the effort and we made the investment to comply with the local regulations from the telecom regulators, but also with the constraints imposed by the Ministry of Interior of each of the countries. Okay. So that's where you see that connectivity for IoT is just more complex than just to provide connectivity. Sure. There is the local marketing, compliance with local regulations aspect, and also security rules imposed by the countries.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting when we talk about the connectivity space, because in IoT, especially in the commercial and enterprise side, there's a lot of different types of connectivity that fits potential use cases. So trying to optimize that. And then once you start moving outside of the borders of a local market, you have other challenges that you have to deal with. So one thing I wanted to ask is when we're talking about, let's focus for a second, like on cellular IoT projects, for instance, when you're trying to scale those in Europe and even then outside of Europe, what are the things that people really need to be thinking about or need to take into consideration, and kind of what advice do you have for people approaching that?
I would say two things. The first thing is what I just said about how to comply with the regulations in Europe, in US, in Japan, and so on. That's what I was talking about. But secondly, you could say that if I want to comply, then fine. I can deal with AT&T in the US, with Vodafone for Europe, then with AT&T for Japan, and with Telefonica for Latin America. What you will see is that if you do that, first you have to face multiple integration. You have to integrate with AT&T for the US, with Vodafone for Europe, with AT&T for Japan, with other operators for Latin America. So that's the first challenge, where you basically multiply your cost of integration, you multiply them by 4 or by 5. But also you will see that even Vodafone in Europe will not comply with the local regulations in every country. Why that? Because by nature, mobile network operators do comply with the local regulations where it has footprint. Ask Vodafone to provide an offer in France. That's more difficult for them because they are not in France. They are using SFR. And then SFR is a different operators than Vodafone. So this is why Transatel is one of our key differentiators. Because we have an MVNO by our DNA, we are nowhere. That means we are everywhere. And where we did invest is not so much in having a network, because we buy connectivity from the network, but we did invest in complying with the local regulations and offering to our customer a single interface for world connectivity with compliance with the local regulations.